January 17, 1943. The pre-dawn sky over northern Germany is a deep, cold gray. The wind bites through the thin jackets of Luftwaffe ground crews as they scurry along the tarmac, checking Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf Fw 190s. Engines hum, clattering against the winter air, while mechanics tighten bolts and load ammunition, every movement precise, rehearsed. Somewhere beyond the fields, the distant lights of towns fade under the morning fog. High above, the first silhouettes of American bombers appear, tiny black dots against the vast gray sky. German eyes widen. Reports had every heartbeat measures courage, the Germans cannot believe it. These bombers, will they return? And the answer will come, sooner than anyone expects. By early 1943, the war in Europe had reached a critical juncture. The United States Army Air Forces had committed to a bold strategy, daylight precision bombing of German industrial centers. Unlike the British, who relied on night raids to avoid flak and fighters, American doctrine emphasized accuracy, aiming to disrupt the production lines powering the Wehrmacht. Factories in cities like Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Friedrichshafen were no longer safe, they were strategic targets, heartbeats of Germany's war machine. The Luftwaffe, confident and battle-hardened, believed these targets would be defended adequately, yet vulnerable. Intelligence reports consistently underestimated the durability of American aircraft. To German eyes, the bombers were fragile, slow, and ill-prepared for the dense flak and swift interceptors that patrolled the skies. Time and again, German pilots expected victory to be routine, a few bursts of cannon fire, flak bursts, and the intruders would crumble. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a revelation. Designed in the late 1930s, it combined rugged construction with heavy defensive armament. Each bomber carried multiple .50 caliber machine guns in nose, tail, dorsal, and ventral positions. For right our 1820 engines provided range, lifting bomb loads exceeding 4,000 pounds over hundreds of miles. Its aluminum frame, reinforced with armor plating around vital compartments, allowed the aircraft to absorb damage that would have downed other bombers. In practice, the Flying Fortress did more than survive, it returned. Crews learned quickly that formation flying was not just doctrine, it was survival. Tight, box-like formations created overlapping fields of fire, turning the bomber groups into mobile fortresses. Every B-17 had a wingman, every gunner a neighbor. For the Americans, courage was measured in hours of daylight spent under fire. For the Germans, the expectation was swift attrition, the stakes were high. On the ground, American crews trained relentlessly. Gunners practiced until muscle memory became instinct. Pilots learned to manage damaged engines, to keep formations intact even under heavy attack. Bombardiers, hunched over Norden bomb sites, calculated trajectories with mathematical precision. Every detail mattered, because German fighters and flak batteries were waiting. By late 1942, the U.S. 8th Air Force had established bases in eastern England. From there, hundreds of bombers could reach industrial heartlands of southern Germany. The first missions were experimental, probing defenses, testing tactics, gathering intelligence. Losses were expected, high attrition was accepted as part of the learning curve. Yet even early raids demonstrated the resilience of the Flying Fortress. Aircraft with gaping holes in fuselages, shattered control surfaces, and burned engines often limped home. Each return was a quiet shock to the German observers, yet few altered their calculations immediately. The Luftwaffe's perspective was rooted in years of air combat success. Fighters like the Bf 109 and Fw 190 dominated earlier European campaigns. Flak guns, strategically placed around cities and industrial zones, were expected to annihilate unescorted bombers. German pilots assumed that no formation could withstand the concentrated firepower they wielded. Intelligence assessments predicted massive losses for any daylight raid, yet underestimated the Americans' training, cohesion, and aircraft design. On January 17, 1943, as the cold winter dawn broke, all these elements collided. German defenses were alert, their guns primed, fighters ready on the tarmac. American crews climbed into their B-17s with a mixture of routine discipline and stark awareness of the risk. Bombs were loaded, engines warmed, and formations briefed. The Luftwaffe expected a massacre. But the flying fortresses were built to endure, crews trained to survive, and the German assumptions about their fragility were about to be tested in a way no report or calculation had anticipated. From the first rumble of engines to the distant sight of bomb bays opening over the target, the stage was set. The Germans were about to witness something remarkable, machines designed to be destroyed, returning time and again. The strategic bombing campaign was no longer theoretical, it was becoming a tangible force, reshaping the calculus of air power over Europe. The disbelief among German commanders was almost palpable. Their doctrine, honed over years of victories, did not account for aircraft that could sustain crippling damage and still fly home. Their pilots braced for another routine kill, but the flying fortresses, unbroken and persistent, were about to redefine the rules of aerial combat. By late 1942, the U.S. 8th Air Force had begun to understand both the promise and peril of strategic daylight bombing. Early raids over France and the Low Countries tested the limits of range and formation tactics, while gathering vital intelligence on German defenses. Each sortie carried its own lessons: the fragility of the aircraft, the ruthlessness of Flak, the skill of Luftwaffe interceptors, and the resolve of the air crews. Losses were inevitable, yet every mission also delivered a crucial truth: some bombers returned, battered but intact. For the Germans, these initial raids were baffling. Intelligence officers reported the incoming formations, counted the damaged aircraft, and expected a clear picture of attrition. Yet after each raid, reports from the front were inconsistent. American bombers were not simply destroyed. They were wounded and returned to base, engines smoking, control surfaces bent, fuselages perforated by flak and cannon fire. Ground crews and German commanders alike struggled to reconcile this with their understanding of air combat. How could a bomber withstand multiple fighter attacks and survive hundreds of explosive flak bursts over heavily defended targets? The psychological effect on the Luftwaffe was immediate. Pilots who had anticipated easy kills began to experience hesitation. Mission reports described B-17s in box formations, firing in coordinated volleys that repelled attackers. Even experienced Luftwaffe pilots admitted in logs that the bombers were tougher than predicted or almost unkillable if flying in formation. It was an unfamiliar reality for a force trained to dominate the skies. Meanwhile, the Americans refined their tactics with a relentless focus on survivability. Training emphasized mutual support within formations. Each bomber's gunners covered overlapping fields, protecting wingmen from side attacks. Pilots learned to adjust altitude, speed, and formation shape dynamically, reducing vulnerability to both flak and fighter assaults. Bombardiers practiced precision under fire, calculating trajectories while engines roared and bombs rattled in the bays. Every hour spent in the air was a lesson in endurance and teamwork. At the same time, technological resilience played a crucial role. The B-17's ability to sustain heavy damage without catastrophic failure became a central feature of American confidence. Engines could continue running after multiple hits, hydraulic lines were redundant, control surfaces could be improvised with jury-rigged repairs mid-flight. German intelligence had observed some of these survivals but could not believe the frequency. Their doctrine assumed that a single well-placed cannon or flak burst could disable a bomber. Reality, however, was proving otherwise. By January 1943, these lessons had coalesced into a formidable reputation. German pilots and commanders expected losses to mount, yet reports showed that significant percentages of B-17 crews returned from missions even after heavy engagement. Morale among Luftwaffe units began to waver, not because they were losing every fight, but because the Americans seemed almost impossible to destroy entirely. The Flying Fortress was not invincible, but it was resilient beyond German expectations. Previous raids, such as those on the industrial hubs of Regensburg and Schweinfurt, provided stark evidence. Bombers were observed limping home with engines smoking, wings damaged, and fuselages riddled with holes. Survivors described crews continuing to fire, to navigate, to reach base under conditions that would have grounded almost any other aircraft. Each successful return was a quiet shock, undermining assumptions about the vulnerability of American heavy bombers. The stage for January 17, 1943, was set by months of these observations. German commanders had prepared, Luftwaffe pilots had briefed, Flak batteries had been positioned, yet confidence was tempered with unease. Reports from prior missions suggested a troubling pattern. The B-17s, despite damage and exposure, were returning. The Germans could not imagine why. Until they faced the reality firsthand, the contrast could not have been sharper. On the ground, Luftwaffe crews prepared to intercept what they assumed would be fragile, easily destroyed formations. Above, American airmen climbed into aircraft that had been proven capable of withstanding punishment, bolstered by training, formation discipline, and unyielding resolve. The collision between expectation and reality was inevitable. As the first B-17s appeared on the horizon over Germany that morning, the Luftwaffe would confront a truth that defied their doctrine. These bombers were not only surviving, they were coming back, again and again. This revelation would shape perspectives, tactics, and morale, setting the stage for the multiple angles through which this historic moment must be understood. Inside the cramped fuselage of a B-17, the human dimension of the mission was as critical as the aircraft itself. Crews endured bitter cold at 25,000 feet, the wind whistling through gaps in the fuselage and oxygen masks fogging with every exhale. Each man had a role, a responsibility, and an awareness that the slightest lapse could be fatal. Pilots navigated using rudimentary instruments, often blinded by smoke or sunlight reflecting off ice-covered wings. Bombardiers hunched over their Norden sights, calculating trajectories while under the thrum of engines and the distant, terrifying explosions of anti-aircraft flak. Fear was constant, but so was discipline. Radio operators relayed orders while gunners scanned the sky for attacking fighters. When tracers zipped past, gunners leaned into their .50 caliber machine guns, muscles tensed, eyes locked on the enemy. Survival depended not on luck alone but on every crew member performing their duties flawlessly. When German fighters dived from above, bombers returned fire in unison, a chorus of controlled violence. Each B-17 was not just a machine, it was a community, a tightly bound team forged under extreme conditions. Tactics dictated the difference between life and death in daylight raids over Germany. The U.S. 8th Air Force developed a doctrine of combat box formations. Tight, staggered groups that maximized overlapping fields of defensive fire. Flying in these boxes required precision, even a small deviation could create deadly gaps for Luftwaffe fighters to exploit. Bombers coordinated altitudes, headings, and speeds to maintain cohesion, all while under threat from ground-based flak and high-speed attackers. Escort fighters, initially limited in range, became essential for survival. P-47 Thunderbolts and later P-51 Mustangs accompanied formations deeper into enemy territory, intercepting Luftwaffe fighters before they could break the bombers' defensive perimeter. German commanders were baffled by the coordination. Previous campaigns had assumed daylight raids were suicidal. Yet, through disciplined formations, defensive gun coverage, and timely fighter support, losses, though significant, were often lower than the Luftwaffe predicted. Each mission was a chess match. Bombers adjusted to anti-aircraft fire patterns, navigated around clouds, and responded to unexpected attacks with split-second decisions. The combination of tactical planning and crew training turned what seemed like vulnerable aircraft into formidable obstacles. At the core of the B-17's mystique was its engineering. The Flying Fortress was designed to endure punishment that would cripple other bombers. Each aircraft carried up to 10 defensive machine guns, covering virtually every angle. Its structure could sustain multiple flak hits, with control surfaces and engines often remaining operational despite serious damage. Redundant systems allowed pilots to maintain maneuverability even if one or more engines failed. the Norden bombsight exemplified technological precision. Pilots and bombardiers could calculate trajectories to hit industrial targets with a remarkable degree of accuracy, even at altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet. The integration of armor, defensive armament, and advanced navigation systems made the B-17 both durable and deadly. Even German intelligence, observing the aircraft over multiple missions, could not comprehend how consistently battered bombers returned. Reports described engines riddled with holes, fuselages peppered with flak, and control cables severed, yet crews still landed safely. It was a combination of human skill and technological resilience that defied expectations, earning the Flying Fortress its legendary status. The success of the B-17 missions depended as much on leadership as on aircraft or crew skill. Generals like Karl Spaatz and Jimmy Doolittle understood that daylight bombing could only succeed if planning was meticulous and command decisive. Mission orders were detailed to the smallest element, formation patterns, altitudes, target approaches, and fallback plans in case of heavy resistance. Briefings were exhaustive. Every pilot, navigator, and gunner knew the mission objectives, contingencies, and their role in the formation. Doolittle, in particular, emphasized speed, cohesion, and discipline. He understood that morale and confidence were as crucial as engines and guns. Leaders on the ground coordinated maintenance, ensuring aircraft were airworthy despite harsh winter conditions. Squadron leaders instilled a culture of resilience, training crews to anticipate damage, improvise repairs mid-flight, and rely on each other under fire. On the German side, leadership faced confusion. Commanders relied on decades of air combat doctrine that assumed daylight bombers were inherently vulnerable. The repeated return of damaged B-17s challenged assumptions, leaving commanders frustrated and increasingly uncertain. Their tactics, once reliable, failed to achieve the decisive attrition they expected, revealing cracks in the German operational model. For Luftwaffe pilots, the Flying Fortress was an enigma. Experienced aces, veterans of campaigns across Europe, approached the American formations with confidence, expecting easy kills. Yet their attacks often proved ineffective. The B-17's overlapping fields of fire made head-on approaches deadly, and gunners' accuracy increased with each engagement. Fighters were met not with passive resistance, but with coordinated, relentless defensive fire that often destroyed attacking aircraft. The psychological impact on the enemy was profound. Mission reports from German pilots described frustration, disbelief, and even fear when formations returned battered but intact. Some pilots noted, almost incredulously, that bombers continued to fly even after sustaining hits that should have been fatal. Their confidence eroded, altering the Luftwaffe's approach to subsequent missions. They had trained for dominance, yet the Flying Fortresses forced a reconsideration of tactics, strategy, and expectations of aerial warfare. The resilience of the B-17 had ramifications beyond tactics. It influenced morale on both sides. For American crews, each successful return reinforced courage, unity, and trust in the aircraft. Crews bonded under adversity, sharing stories of damaged bombers, injured comrades, and near misses. Survival became a testament to human endurance, to preparation, and to the belief that skill and discipline could overcome adversity. For the Germans, the opposite occurred. Witnessing these bombers survive attacks they expected to be fatal caused confusion, anxiety, and diminishing confidence in their doctrine. Propaganda departments struggled to frame the narrative. The invulnerability of the Flying Fortress contradicted the expectation of swift Luftwaffe dominance. Commanders faced a subtle but growing crisis of morale, realizing that repeated American raids could not be easily neutralized. The psychological shock of persistent, returning bombers began to shift planning priorities and defensive strategies. This moral contrast, the rising confidence of the Americans and the growing disbelief among Germans, illustrates why the January 17 raids were more than just tactical encounters. They became symbolic battles, where courage, planning, and technology collided with expectation and surprise. January 17, 1943. The morning light barely touched the snow-dusted fields of northern Germany when the first B-17 formations approached the target. The city of Regensburg awaited, its industrial complexes critical to German aircraft production. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns were positioned strategically around the factories, ready to tear the sky apart with exploding shells. On the tarmac, Luftwaffe pilots watched as black silhouettes pierced the horizon, moving with mechanical precision, unwavering despite the bitter cold. From the air, the American formations appeared almost serene. Bombers flew in tight combat boxes, each plane aligned with its wingman, engines humming in a rhythmic chorus. Within each fuselage, crews braced for impact. Gunners gripped their .50 caliber weapons, scanning relentlessly for flashes of enemy fighters. Pilots adjusted throttles and altimeters, steering through icy gusts and snow-laden clouds. Bombardiers recalculated trajectories as they neared the industrial targets, mindful that accuracy and survival were inseparable. As the first flak bursts erupted, the silence shattered. Explosions rocked the formations, shrapnel tearing through metal and glass. B-17s shook violently, some engines smoking, fuselages riddled with holes. Yet crews maintained formation, gunners returning fire with disciplined precision. Messerschmitts dived from above, attempting to break the box, but each approach met concentrated streams of defensive fire. The Luftwaffe expected carnage. German pilots described the opening minutes as a storm of metal, confident that attrition would decimate the American bombers. Yet the reality was different. Despite severe damage, the flying fortresses pressed on. One bomber lost a wing panel, another struggled with a partially disabled engine, yet both maintained course. Crew members continued their duties with grim determination, gunners fired relentlessly, radio operators relayed vital information, and pilots compensated for damaged controls. Bomb bays opened. Explosions erupted over the factories as bombs hit assembly lines, smoke and fire engulfing the structures below. The Germans scrambled flak batteries to cover gaps, adjusting aim, but the formations remained elusive, shifting in response to fire patterns. For the Americans, every second demanded coordination and courage. For the Germans, disbelief began to take hold. How could these machines, under concentrated fire and repeated attacks, remain airborne? As the bombers began their return leg, the Luftwaffe watched in stunned silence. Reports noted dozens of aircraft that, by any previous standard, should have been destroyed. Engines were missing cowling panels, fuselages bore jagged holes, yet pilots guided them home, formation intact. Gunners, faces streaked with soot and sweat, kept scanning the sky, repelling last-minute fighter attacks. Ground crews on the American bases braced as battered aircraft limped into landing strips, some limping on partial landing gear, others escorted by less damaged wingmen. The psychological impact on the Germans was immediate. Commanders who had calculated high attrition rates now faced evidence that challenged every assumption. Pilots exchanged incredulous glances. "They should not have returned," wrote one observer. "Yet here they are, whole, fighting, alive." Intelligence reports reflected the same astonishment. The flying fortress was not just surviving, it was returning with crews intact, ready for another mission. By nightfall, the first mission had concluded. Damage was significant, losses unavoidable, yet the resilience displayed by the B-17s shattered German expectations. The meticulous planning of American leaders, the cohesion and courage of the crews, and the durability of the aircraft had combined in a moment that would leave the Luftwaffe questioning doctrine, tactics, and the very nature of daylight strategic bombing. The first mission's return set the stage for an even more shocking development. The Germans had expected one strike, perhaps two at most, but the Americans had proven a terrifying truth: these bombers could, and would, come back. This disbelief, unrelenting and profound, leads naturally to the follow-up mission the next day, when the Luftwaffe would face the flying fortress once more, under the same punishing conditions. January 18, 1943. Just 24 hours after the stunning return of the battered B-17s, American crews prepared for another mission. The targets remained the industrial centers of southern Germany, factories producing aircraft engines and critical components. On the ground, Luftwaffe commanders pored over reconnaissance reports from the previous day, their confidence shaken. Pilots were briefed on the resilience of the flying fortresses, the tenacity of their gunners, and the precision of American formation flying. They steeled themselves for another encounter, but uncertainty lingered like a shadow over every command decision. Above the North German plains, the first formations appeared, engines roaring through the winter air. The bombers were immediately under fire, flak exploding in timed barrages, shredding clouds with steel fragments. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs dove from the sky, attempting to peel planes from the tight combat boxes. German pilots, expecting an easy strike, found their approaches repelled by overlapping defensive fire. Tracers streaked through the sky, illuminating the discipline of the American crews. Despite heavy hits, the formations pressed onward. One B-17 lost part of its tail assembly, another suffered a damaged engine that threatened to fail completely. Pilots improvised, balancing asymmetric thrust, and maintained alignment with their boxes. Gunners continued firing, eyes wide, hands numb, yet unflinching. Even under concentrated fire, these planes refused to falter. For the Germans, the scene was almost surreal. Every strike that should have brought a bomber down instead met with a defiant persistence. Bombs were released on the targets. Factories erupted in smoke and fire, conveyor belts and assembly lines disrupted, engines destroyed before they could leave the production floor. Flak crews scrambled, attempting to recalibrate, but the bombers' evasive maneuvers and formation discipline minimized exposure. Each bomber that released its payload intact and began the return flight deepened the Luftwaffe's sense of disbelief. On the return leg, damage reports revealed the extraordinary resilience of the B-17. Engines riddled with holes continued to function, fuselages perforated by cannon fire flexed under stress but held together, hydraulic systems failed in some cases, yet pilots managed control manually. Injured crew members assisted each other in cramped compartments. Radio operators relayed critical damage assessments, helping formation leaders make rapid decisions to preserve the aircraft and lives. German intelligence observers recorded the unfolding scene with incredulity. Reports noted dozens of bombers limping home, some trailing smoke, others missing control surfaces, yet all remained airborne. "Impossible," one Luftwaffe officer wrote. "They should have crashed in flames, yet they come back, and they will come again." The sheer repetition of survival created a psychological shock. These were no isolated incidents. American bombers were proving not only capable of enduring punishment but returning to strike again the very next day. For American crews, the experience reinforced lessons learned under fire. Confidence grew in both aircraft and team. Damage assessments would later reveal severe hits to engines, fuselage, and control surfaces, yet casualties were minimized, and mission objectives achieved. The Flying Fortress, combined with the unwavering courage of its crews, had established a new reality. Daylight bombing over Germany was no longer a gamble. It was a calculated, persistent threat that the Luftwaffe had no immediate solution for. By the end of the second mission, German commanders faced a stark truth. Doctrine, experience, and expectations had been upended. The B-17s were not fragile, and American crews were not reckless. They were trained, coordinated, and determined. The Luftwaffe's confidence in intercepting or destroying formations of flying fortresses had diminished dramatically. Morale wavered among pilots, and strategic recalculations became unavoidable. The follow-up mission solidified a turning point in air warfare. Germany realized that attrition alone would not neutralize the American daylight bombing campaign. The Flying Fortress had become a symbol of endurance, precision, and human courage. Its repeated return challenged assumptions, reshaped tactics, and forced both sides to confront the realities of modern strategic bombing. The first two missions over Germany left a mark far beyond the damage inflicted on industrial targets. In the wake of January 17 to 18, reports began to circulate detailing not only the destruction at Regensburg and surrounding factories but also the extraordinary survival of the B-17 formations. American losses were significant but far lower than the Luftwaffe had predicted, and the number of bombers returning intact stunned both sides. Damage assessments revealed factories disrupted, assembly lines halted, and engines destroyed before they could reach aircraft production schedules. Smoke rose from bombed plants, alarms rang across industrial zones, and emergency crews scrambled to contain the destruction. The strategic impact, though measured in tons of bombs and hours of work lost, was amplified by the psychological effects. German commanders faced the unsettling reality that their defenses had failed to prevent American bombers from completing their objectives. The Luftwaffe was forced to reassess its calculations. Commanders, accustomed to the predictable destruction of enemy bombers in daylight, now confronted a new reality. Reports from pilots described the resilience of the B-17s in stark terms: engines perforated, fuselages torn open, gunner positions damaged, yet the aircraft continued to fly. The repeated success of formation discipline and defensive fire undermined German confidence in their established doctrine. On the American side, morale soared. Crews shared stories of damaged bombers and narrowly avoided disaster, yet each survival reinforced a sense of camaraderie and purpose. Mission planners meticulously analyzed the damage patterns, noting which formations had endured the most, which tactics had minimized losses, and how defensive fire had protected vulnerable aircraft. Each data point informed the next mission, creating a feedback loop of increasing efficiency, coordination, and resilience. Intelligence reports captured the Germans' incredulity. Observers wrote of pilots refusing to believe their eyes, as B-17s limped across the sky with smoking engines, holes in their fuselages, and gunners still firing. One Luftwaffe officer noted, "Even the most damaged craft returned as if mocking our calculations. We had planned for attrition, we were confronted with endurance." Such reports circulated quickly, forcing tactical reconsideration and an uneasy acknowledgement that the American strategic bombing campaign was not a fleeting threat but a persistent, organized challenge. Even on the ground in Germany, the perception of vulnerability began to shift. Civilians watching from rooftops or the edges of towns noticed the American formations, taking note of their size, discipline, and apparent invincibility. Propaganda offices struggled to frame the raids in ways that would maintain public confidence, yet the sheer resilience of the bombers complicated messaging. Each report of returning aircraft undermined prior assumptions about the inevitability of destruction. The combination of operational effectiveness and psychological impact forced immediate changes. Luftwaffe units began adjusting fighter patrol patterns, increasing flak density, and re-evaluating interception protocols. Yet even with these measures, the Germans could not reverse the emerging lesson. The Flying Fortress, when flown in disciplined formations with trained crews, had redefined the nature of daylight bombing over Germany. The consequences extended beyond immediate tactics. Commanders across the European theater realized that traditional assumptions about bomber vulnerability were no longer valid. For the Americans, the first two raids confirmed that precision, resilience, and cohesion could overcome formidable defenses. For the Germans, the very idea that a bomber could survive repeated attacks challenged doctrine, morale, and strategic planning. The impact of the January 17 to 18 raids extended far beyond immediate destruction. The Luftwaffe faced a sobering truth: attrition alone could not neutralize the American strategic bombing campaign. Doctrinal assumptions had been shattered. Commanders realized that repeated daylight raids, executed with precision and cohesion, could inflict measurable damage while keeping the majority of bombers intact. The psychological shock to German pilots and strategists was profound. Morale among Luftwaffe units suffered. Pilots, accustomed to dominating the skies, faced resilient, heavily armed formations that refused to break. Each encounter with the Flying Fortress reinforced a creeping doubt: no matter how skilled, the German fighters could not easily destroy these bombers. Reports from the front described pilots' hesitation, frustration, and a growing reluctance to engage under conditions previously considered routine. Even elite squadrons found themselves adapting defensively, increasing formation size, adjusting patrol altitudes, and relying on massed flak in ways that consumed resources and limited tactical flexibility. For American crews and planners, the raids validated doctrine and reinforced confidence. The lessons learned informed subsequent missions, from tactics to maintenance protocols. Formation discipline, gunnery coordination, and the integration of long-range fighter escorts became central to 8th Air Force operations. Each mission built on the last, creating a cumulative advantage that German planners struggled to counter. Strategically, the raids influenced broader operational planning. Intelligence assessments and battle reports highlighted vulnerabilities in German industrial hubs, prompting the Allies to prioritize targets for maximum disruption. The Flying Fortress emerged not only as a bomber but as a symbol of American air power, its resilience and precision serving as a psychological weapon in addition to a physical one. German forces had to recalibrate expectations, allocate more resources to air defense, and confront the reality that these raids were not isolated events but a sustained, escalating campaign. Civilians in Germany also felt the long-term effects. Repeated raids over industrial cities reinforced the impression that nowhere was entirely safe. Factories that had survived the initial raids were now under renewed threat, and the predictability of American persistence introduced a pervasive anxiety. Propaganda efforts sought to reassure the populace, but the persistent visibility of the bombers and the reports of their repeated return undermined attempts to maintain morale. The Flying Fortress performance reshaped perceptions of air warfare on both sides. For the Americans, it demonstrated the value of rigorous training, technological innovation, and tactical discipline. For the Germans, it forced recognition that a single aircraft design, combined with strategic planning and coordinated human effort, could challenge centuries of military assumptions. The shock and disbelief of German pilots and commanders underscored a larger truth. Air power had evolved into a decisive factor, capable of challenging even the most confident defenders. By the end of January 1943, the stage for aerial combat over Europe had changed. The B-17 had proven its endurance not just in metal and engines, but in the skill, courage, and resilience of its crews. For the Luftwaffe, each mission underscored a fundamental lesson: the Americans were relentless, prepared, and willing to fly into the heart of danger again and again. The psychological and strategic consequences of these missions would resonate for months, shaping tactics, planning, and the broader conduct of the war in the skies above Europe. The repeated return of battered bombers was more than a tactical anomaly, it was a turning point, a vivid demonstration that human skill, discipline, and resilient technology could defy expectations and force an enemy to reconsider the very nature of warfare. The flights of January 17 and 18, 1943, revealed a profound truth about the nature of war: resilience, preparation, and human courage can defy expectations. The Flying Fortress was more than a machine, it was the embodiment of discipline, training, and technological ingenuity. Crews who climbed into the cold, gray skies of Germany faced near certain danger, yet they returned, battered, exhausted, but unbroken. Their endurance reshaped the calculus of aerial warfare and forced the Luftwaffe to confront a reality they had not anticipated. These missions demonstrated that strategy is not solely measured in firepower or numbers, but in cohesion and morale. German pilots learned, often unwillingly, that assumptions about the fragility of the enemy could lead to miscalculations. The Flying Fortress repeated return became both a tactical and psychological weapon. A reminder that precision, discipline, and teamwork could overcome even the most formidable defenses. The lessons of these raids echo far beyond their immediate context. They highlight the interplay of human will and technological design, the impact of leadership in shaping outcomes, and the unforeseen consequences of resilience under fire. For the Americans, each successful mission reinforced confidence and honed a doctrine that would dominate the skies for the rest of the war. For the Germans, it was a humbling reminder that innovation and perseverance could challenge assumptions and demand adaptation. Ultimately, the story of the B-17s is not only about steel and engines, but about the people who trusted them with their lives. The battered bombers that returned from Germany carried more than bombs, they carried the proof that courage, skill, and determination could withstand destruction and redefine the limits of possibility. In the sweep of history, these missions stand as a testament to the enduring human spirit, the evolving art of warfare, and the profound impact of resilience in shaping the course of events.